Okay, so this is part 2. And I think this is interesting because I made this comment on Facebook that was sort of a very predictive comment on the 23rd of October of last year in 2016. So there's this thing about the number 23, which adds up to 5, which is also a very interesting number numerologically. But someone was asking about timeline shifts, and I just wrote this. I guess if you want to stop the video and look at that, you can. But I wanted to talk about timeline shifts that are happening now are actually, and this is what I sort of intuited or sort of semi-channeled when I wrote this, but it was about a timeline shift that would be permanent for this Earth, space, time reality within 3 to 4 years' time of the writing of that comment. And the fluctuations are part of a shift in humanity's consciousness and consciousness in general outside of this timeline and in the universe, both known and unknown. And if you haven't healed karmic wounds by then and healed any dysfunction you have, you're going to go to the place of existential wounds, and you won't have anything to do with healthy people. So stop blaming problems on timeline shifts, or in the case of the New Age bowel movement or the conspiracy movements, external factors. External factors are just symptoms of internal stuff that we aren't processing or addressing correctly. So the natural urge for the neurotic urge for a lot of people in the New Age movement and the New Age bowel movement and the conspiracoid culture is to blame a scapegoat. There's a lot of neurotic tendencies or a need in the New Age community to sort of blame the victim and say you attracted that to yourself, but really it's a lot of unprocessed trauma inside of yourself that you're not looking at or addressing. So it's incorrect to say you attracted that to yourself, because if you have trauma, you're simply repeating an unconscious pattern of trauma and not attracting, but simply moving towards that which is familiar to you. How can you go towards something you're unfamiliar with? You will naturally, will unconscious, if they're unconscious and they don't consciously stop the pattern, they will unconsciously continue the pattern and go towards what is incredibly familiar to them, which makes them open to starting more of the same pattern with cult leaders, and if they're especially impressionable, and going towards the same psychopaths and the same narcissists and the same over and over and over again. And then they blame themselves, and then they do horrible things to themselves and are incredibly hard on themselves, and or they lash out neurotically towards others and say you did it to yourself. See what you did. But it's really not. It's unconscious patterns reenacting themselves, also known in psychology as repetition compulsion. So if we're doing these unconscious patterns, guess what? The unconscious goes somewhere. It goes into conscious reality, whether we like it or not. So the more consciousness we have, just like Willy Whitefeather says, the more we go into coincidences. The way he phrases it is CO-incidences. That is when the great peace will come. So, and that's the peace inside yourself that everyone has to do in order to understand themselves and their world around them instead of the chaos that ensues. So we have so much chaos in our world right now, and that's mostly semi-created at the very least by our unconscious selves. Attaching themselves to an external factor. And that's a lot of neurotic fantasies being allowed to run rampant because we have let them, because we don't want to look at something that is painful, and or we don't want to look at the state of the world because something is possibly behind it. I don't know. Going on to that, the way I sort of intuited it was as a timeline rift that was co-created by us all, that we all unconsciously created timeline rifts, and that we are, now I could be wrong here, but it on an esoteric level, I said 2017 sees a start of the cosmic cleanup going on for the next several years with a lot of upheaval. And I wasn't consciously aware that any of this stuff was going to happen. Donald Trump had not been elected president or anything like that at that point. Keep in mind, this was October 23rd, 2016. And I said, so there's in the next several years, there's going to be a lot of upheaval, and then through the next 9 or 10 years, there will be adjustments. But by then, the two splits in the timelines will have occurred, and ne'er the twain shall meet. So people with limited thinking will remain in limitation and fear and doubt, and the rest of us will move on regardless of the timeline shift. The problem is not the timeline differentials. The problem is how we, quote, look at them, end quote. If we look at them with scarcity-based mindsets about how sinister and damaging it is, then guess what? It's sinister and damaging. If we look at it as co-creational and part of our evolutionary learning curve and make up as co-creators and manifestors, where what's happening on the inside collectively and individually often has an outlet of manifestation on the outside. And when we learn to control that on the inside, then guess what? Instant upgrade. So fear and limitation and suspicion serves no purpose going forward. Opening up your third eye responsibly and healing the timelines in your past lives that no longer serve you as a lesson does. Heal, recognize, accept, process, and go through. There is no other way. Resisting will make for more earthquakes, more external manifestations of the timeline that make this rocky and our dreams, quote, unobtainable, quote. Realizing that we are part of a contribution to this, quote, problem, quote, and we can find the solutions too, instead of always doomsdaying it to death, can create more rifts in the timeline. Fear always does. Fear and limitation result in more fear and limitation. Something is not always what it seems, and we have more power to change it than most of us currently realize. But timeline shifts are a manifestation of guilt and neuroses and fear that we are not enough, and some other, quote, great engineer, quote, has been positing it. But really, we are asleep at the wheel, unconsciously causing chaos until we subjectively and emotionally and collectively decide that enough is enough. And that time is coming. And I've talked in the past in my interview with Scott at Ayahuasca Magic last year, around that time actually, about poltergeists and how a lot of people with a lot of sexual abuse and trauma can subconsciously or unconsciously create a lot of telekinetic activity. And I had mentioned that all four of us, my roommates and myself in that haunted house I lived in, yes, there were definitely ghosts and lots of activity and things that go bump in the night. But there were some incidents that I wonder if we weren't unconsciously causing things to fly through the air, like cans of food and stuff and strange things like that. Or at the very least, like attracting like, simply because we were unconscious in our patterns. And having done a lot of paranormal investigations, going through houses, doing house cleanings, sending people to the light, ghosts to the light and the like, letting them become aware that they had passed and they weren't aware that they had died. And they caused a lot of mayhem for the owners of the homes that I did these cleanings in. And I would immediately, in many cases, be able to send them to the light once I made them aware that they were no longer in the earth plane. And it was very easy once they became aware, with a lot of love and compassion and so forth, that they could in fact move on to the next world. They could go to the next stage of existence. And it was much better than being trapped in an old house, throwing things at the owner because you're angry and you don't want them to be there because you don't know that you've died yet. Or your physical form is no longer available, at least. I think death is vastly oversimplified and that it gets a bad rap, but that's a whole other discussion. In my opinion, there's no such thing as death. Consciousness, at least. Consciousness is it survives the physical mortification of the body, in my direct personal experience. And this was corroborated by having another psychic medium who was isolated by another member of the paranormal investigation unit. And they would be in a totally different part of the house. They would not hear me. And they would come up with the exact same information and tell the investigator the exact same thing when they were also separately brought into the same room I was in. So it was corroborated again and again and again and again that these people were lost, confused, felt and over-obligation as the departed spirits who had not left the building, literally, to protect the home against this invader they saw as an invader, and they didn't understand they were dead yet. In some cases, some of them did know they were dead, and it was okay. They just loved the place, and I was able to negotiate as a mediator between the living and the dead who both shared the house. So that's what I did a lot when I was doing paranormal investigations. Those were really fun. I really enjoyed those, believe it or not. They were not scary at all. They were fun and very loving and very kind, not like the TV shows at all. Those TV shows are horrible. It's basically the equivalent of them making a bear dance with a whip, or they're very cruel to the spirits in the buildings, if there are any at all. And it's a lot of hyperbole and nonsense, but mostly they go in and poke a sleeping bear with a sharp stick, and then they wonder why they don't get any information, or something bad happens, or something is thrown at them. It's just nonsense. They're just provocateurs. A real house cleaning, a real paranormal investigation involves a lot of love and a lot of compassion, and it's very quiet, and it's not like that. Anyway, but that's not sexy, but what they're doing is a grave disservice to those of us who actually want to help the spirits of the departed. But that's Hollywood for you. Hollywood is the home of the magicians, the Hollywood. Anyway, and they don't care about calming people down. They want to amp people up and make them miserable and keep them stuck in duality and materialistic sensibilities that go nowhere. Okay, so again, I'm not anti-materialist things. You need food, clothing, shelter. You need a quality of life that doesn't make you mentally ill, but that's not what I mean. Hopefully I'm making sense. I may not be. I'm all over the place. Oh, one other thing I wanted to say before I get cut off at the 15-minute mark is the national dress thing and the correlation between these street performances with people dressed up like giant Sasquatches. And it's all over northern and central and southern Europe. They have these festivals with these sort of like animal beasts, kind of Sasquatch types, or Bigfoot types of creatures, and they're often seen banishing the bad spirits down the street. And sometimes those are surprisingly effective ceremonies, believe it or not, because there's a lot of intent there and a lot of noise and banging of instruments and things like that. But also, when you go to one of those cultural festivals where people are in national dress, you'll notice a lot of the women are wearing tons of jewelry that look like UFOs. And so I just always think that's interesting. You look at the national dress of Sardinia, which I'm completely obsessed with. They also have a sort of Sasquatch, sort of weird Anubis type hybrid creature that walks down the street with them. And the Amazigh tribe, which I've talked about, who claim they are in North Africa. They are Caucasian, indigenous to North Africa, and they claim they're from Atlantis. They also, the women, wear jewelry that looks just like UFOs. And I've had UFO experiences, and I know of which I speak. Like, they look literally like UFOs, their jewelry. And the dangling little flying saucers off of their bodies. It's crazy. And it's all gold, which is interesting, which it's always gold. I mean, sometimes it's silver, but in the case of Sardinia, it's always gold, which is interesting. So I wonder if that island was visited a lot by the Anunnaki or something, or the issue of gold and flying saucer jewelry is like all over national dress of women. And you see this all over the world. It's not just Central Europe or Southern Europe or Northern Europe. It's every single national dress, and the embroidery in the tapestries in Africa and every continent. You see this in some form or another with indigenous national costume, which is really interesting. And that's why I love it so much. I love anthropology so much. For so many mysterious reasons. There's so many hidden things. But anyway, this was very rambling, but I think it all kind of ties in a little bit too. And I hope you're enjoying yourselves. And I really hope that the people of Florida are safe, and that everybody makes it through hurricane season alive and well, and there are no more deaths from that. And just understand there's more than meets the eye, and your internal matches your external. Thank you.